The lecture hall held its breath. 30 graduate students sat frozen pens hovering above notebooks, eyes darting between the blackboard and the woman who commanded the room with the precision of a general. Professor Catherine Sterling stood beside her room, one manicured finger pointing toward a man in navy coveralls who had just committed the unthinkable sin of speaking during her demonstration. "Get out." The words landed like a gavel, sharp and final. Her voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of being right, from publications and journals most people couldn't pronounce, from certificates that lined her office walls like trophies in a hunter's lodge. Her heels clicked against the floor as she took a step forwards, designer leather against polished wood, a sound that punctuated her displeasure. "Don't pretend you understand this, janitor." Jamal Washington's hands froze on his cleaning cart. The squeak of its wheels, which had been a barely noticeable background hum moments before, now seemed deafening in the silence. Every eye in the room burned into his back. He could feel the weight of their stares, could sense the smirks forming on faces that belonged to people who paid $65,000 per year for the privilege of sitting in this room learning from this woman breathing this rarefied air. Sterling turned back to her blackboard, dismissing him with the gesture. The complex equations she had been working through still covered the surface in elegant chalk strokes, mathematical symbols that danced across the black expanse like a language most people would never speak. Behind her, mounted on the wall in matching frames, her PhD certificates gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Harvard, MIT, Cambridge. Each one a testament to intellectual superiority, each one a barrier between people like her and people like him. But Jamal didn't move toward the door. Instead, something pulled him forward. His dark eyes scanned the proof on the board, following the logical progression of symbols and equations with an intensity that made Sterling pause mid-gesture, her hand hovering near the eraser. For just a moment, her confident smile faltered. Something in his expression didn't match the uniform he wore, didn't fit the role she had assigned him in her mental hierarchy of human worth. "Actually, Professor," his voice cut through the silence, quiet but clear, carrying a weight that made several students sit up straighter. Sterling turned slowly, her eyebrows arching in that particular way she had perfected over years of dealing with presumptuous undergraduates who thought they knew better than their betters. "There's an error in your third line." The room exploded. Whispers erupted from every corner, a cascade of shocked murmurs that built into a wave of disbelief. A few students laughed, short barking sounds that were more nervous than amused. Someone in the back dropped a pen, and the clatter seemed impossibly loud. Sterling's face went through a fascinating progression of emotions in the span of 3 seconds: shock, anger, dismissal, and finally a cold, calculating contempt that settled over her features like frost. This is where the story truly begins, though none of them knew it yet. This is where everything Catherine Sterling believed about intelligence, about merit, about the natural order of the world would begin its slow, inexorable collapse. This is where Jamal Washington would start the journey from invisible to unavoidable. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, how a mathematics professor and a janitor came to stand on opposite sides of a chasm built from prejudice and pride, we need to go back. We need to go back 3 days. 3 days earlier, Whitmore University sprawled across 200 acres of New England perfection, all red brick and ivy-covered walls, marble columns and manicured lawns that cost more to maintain than most people earned in a year. In early October, the campus transformed into a postcard of American academic excellence. Maple trees blazed orange and gold, their leaves drifting down onto walkways, where students in expensive casual wear strolled between classes, discussing Kant and Keynesian economics over coffee that cost $8 per cup. The architecture spoke of history and permanence. Buildings that had stood for over a century housed departments where professors pursued knowledge with the kind of focused intensity that required isolation from the mundane concerns of ordinary life. Libraries with reading rooms paneled in oak laboratories equipped with equipment that represented the cutting edge of scientific research, lecture halls with acoustics designed to carry a professor's voice to every corner without electronic amplification. But beneath this surface of intellectual pursuit ran a current of hierarchy as rigid as any medieval court. Students arrived in September already sorted by their family names, their high school pedigrees, their ability to write checks that wouldn't bounce. Faculty members competed for publication counts and grant money for corner offices, and endowed chairs for the respective colleagues who measured worth in citations and conferences. And below both groups, largely invisible to the people whose lives they maintained, worked the staff. Security guards, cafeteria workers, groundskeepers, janitors. The natural order, some called it. The way things had always been the way they were meant to be. Catherine Sterling's office occupied a corner of Thornton Hall's third floor, a position that offered views of both the Central Quad and the mathematics building where most of her teaching took place. She had fought for this space, had leveraged her publication record and her growing reputation to secure what lesser faculty members could only envy. Now on a Tuesday morning in early October, she stood at her window watching students cross the quad below her reflection, ghosting across the glass. 35 years old and already a full professor. The achievement still filled her with satisfaction even 3 years after her promotion. She had published 17 papers in top-tier journals, had won the Bergman Prize for her work in complex analysis, had turned down offers from Stanford and Berkeley to stay at Whitmore where her star continued to rise. In a field dominated by men, many of them older and convinced of their superiority, she had forced her way to the table through sheer brilliance and relentless work. Her office reflected this success, the certificates on the wall arranged with careful precision, the bookshelf lined with texts, many bearing her contributions in the acknowledgments or references. The photographs from conferences where she stood beside Fields medalists and National Medal of Science winners, her smile confident, her posture suggesting she belonged in their company. The desk, imported mahogany that had cost more than most people's cars, held stacks of papers waiting for her review grant proposals in various stages of completion, letters from colleagues seeking her expertise. She had earned every inch of this space, had sacrificed relationships, sleep, health to climb this mountain, had endured professors who assumed she was a secretary, not a colleague, had sat through seminars where her questions were dismissed until a man repeated them verbatim, 5 minutes later to nods of approval, had published under her initials for her first 3 papers because reviewers were more generous when they assumed K. Sterling was a man. But she had won, had proven herself undeniable, had built walls of credentials so high that no one could question her place among the intellectual elite. Her phone buzzed, a text from Marcus Webb, her boyfriend of 8 months, a fellow mathematician currently teaching at Harvard. Their relationship had begun at a conference in Princeton, 2 brilliant minds recognizing each other across a crowded reception, engaging in the kind of intellectual flirtation that led first to drinks, then to his hotel room, then to a weekend in Vermont where they had discussed topology and differential equations between sessions of increasingly athletic sex. Marcus understood her in ways no one else could. Understood the drive that made her check email at midnight, the anxiety that came with submitting papers for peer review, the particular satisfaction of proving a theorem that had resisted solution for months. He shared her background, her education, her assumption that intelligence required the right pedigree. Dinner Friday. His text read, "Colleague from Cambridge visiting. Would love your insights." She typed back, "Absolutely. My place at 8 perfect. Wear that blue dress." She smiled. Marcus appreciated her appearance as much as her mind, a combination she had learned to leverage. In faculty meetings, she dressed for impact, knowing that her intelligence was harder to dismiss when packaged in Armani suits and Louboutin heels. Let them notice her appearance first. By the time they finished cataloging her aesthetic presentation, she would have already demonstrated that her brain outmatched theirs. A knock at her door pulled her attention from the window. Sarah Mitchell, her doctoral student and protege, stood in the hallway holding a stack of papers. "Come in," Sarah entered with the cautious respect of a junior scholar approaching a mentor who held her future in perfectly manicured hands. 26 years old, MIT undergraduate degree, published twice already, Sarah represented exactly the kind of student Sterling enjoyed cultivating. Brilliant, driven, willing to work the long hours that real mathematics demanded, but also appropriately deferential understanding that the relationship between professor and student required clear boundaries of authority. "I've finished the revisions on the boundary value paper." Sarah set the stack on Sterling's desk, her fingers not quite trembling, but close. She had been working on this paper for 7 months, a collaboration that would cement her reputation if it was accepted by the Journal of Differential Equations. But acceptance required perfection, and Sterling's standards made perfectionism look casual. Sterling picked up the top page, her eyes scanning the introduction. She read in silence for 30 seconds while Sarah stood motionless waiting. Then she set it down. Better. The section on existence proofs is much clearer, but your lemma on page 12 still needs work. The current wording suggests conditions that are stronger than necessary. Sarah nodded, pulling out a pen to make notes. Sterling watched her, remembering her own graduate student days. The terror of advisor meetings, the crushing self-doubt that came with negative feedback, the slow realization that brilliance wasn't enough, that you also needed resilience and stubbornness and a willingness to defend your ideas against people who assumed you were wrong. But Sterling's own advisor had been different from her. Professor Harold Sterling, no relation despite sharing a last name, had seen her potential immediately, had pushed her harder than he pushed his other students because he recognized something special, had written recommendation letters that opened doors, had made phone calls to colleagues, had ensured her first publication landed in a top journal rather than a secondary venue. She tried to be that kind of mentor to Sarah, demanding but fair, critical but supportive, building the next generation of mathematical excellence. Submit this to the journal by Friday. I'll write the cover letter tonight. Sarah's face brightened. Thank you, Professor Sterling. I really appreciate your guidance on this. After she left, Sterling turned back to her window. Below, students continued their migration across campus, moving between classes and social obligations, their lives structured by schedules that someone else had designed. She watched them with something between affection and contempt. They were so young, so unaware of the battles waiting for them in the real world, so convinced that their expensive educations guaranteed success. Most of them would disappear into mediocrity, would take their degrees and their sense of entitlement into corporate jobs or law schools or medical programs, would become comfortable and conventional, would forget the heady intoxication of pure intellectual pursuit. Only a few would stick with it, would choose the hard path of academic research, would sacrifice everything else to the pursuit of knowledge. And fewer still would excel. Her phone rang. The department chair, Professor David Chen, calling about the upcoming Euler's Challenge. The competition represented one of Whitmore's most prestigious events, $50,000, an automatic PhD admission to the winner, international attention from mathematical communities worldwide. Sterling had served as head judge for the past 3 years, a role she took seriously. Catherine, just confirming you're prepared for next week's announcement. Absolutely, I prepared the registration materials and the preliminary screening problems. Excellent. The dean is very excited about the media coverage this year. Apparently, several international outlets are planning to cover it. Sterling smiled. The Euler's Challenge had grown in prestige under her leadership. She had raised the difficulty level, had implemented rigorous screening to ensure only serious candidates competed, had turned it into a genuine test of mathematical maturity rather than a glorified puzzle contest. I've designed the problems to truly challenge our graduate students. This won't be easy. That's what we want, intellectual rigor, Whitmore standards. After the call ended, Sterling pulled out her notes for the competition. The problems she had selected represented the pinnacle of graduate-level mathematics: complex analysis, differential, topology, functional analysis. Each round would eliminate candidates who lacked the depth of knowledge that came only from years of formal training. She believed absolutely in the validity of this approach. Mathematics wasn't something you could pick up casually, couldn't master through enthusiasm or natural talent alone. It required systematic education, careful progression through prerequisite knowledge, guidance from experts who had traveled the path before you. The idea that someone could bypass this process, could simply intuit their way to mathematical sophistication, was romantic nonsense that served no one. Her own journey had proven this. Years of careful study building on previous years of study, undergraduate coursework leading to graduate seminars, leading to qualifying exams, leading to dissertation research. Each stage preparing her for the next, each building the foundation that made her current work possible. There were no shortcuts. Anyone who claimed otherwise was either lying or deluded. She thought about this as she prepared for her afternoon lecture. The topic was advanced topology, a subject that required substantial mathematical maturity just to understand the basic vocabulary. Her students had been struggling with the recent material, their problem sets revealing gaps in their intuition. Today she would demonstrate a particularly elegant proof, would show them how a real mathematician thought through complex problems. The lecture hall was already filling when she arrived, students claiming their preferred seats, opening laptops and notebooks, settling into the ritual of academic learning. Sterling set her materials on the desk at the front of the room, then turned to write on the blackboard. Her handwriting was precise, each symbol formed with the kind of care that made her proofs as aesthetically pleasing as they were logically rigorous. The proof she had chosen concerned the topology of certain abstract spaces, a result that was both beautiful and counterintuitive. She worked through it methodically, explaining each step, watching her students' faces to gauge their comprehension. Most looked confused, a few looked engaged, one or two looked like they might actually understand. This was normal. Mathematical sophistication took time to develop, and most students in this room were still in the early stages of that development. They could follow symbolic manipulations, could verify that each logical step was valid, but they couldn't yet see the larger structure, couldn't yet develop the intuition that separated competent mathematicians from exceptional ones. She was midway through the proof when she heard it. The squeak of wheels, the soft clatter of cleaning supplies. Maintenance had apparently decided to send someone through during class time, an irritation she would need to address with facilities management. She glanced over her shoulder, briefly saw a man in a navy coveralls pushing a cleaning cart along the sidewall, and dismissed him from her attention. But something made her pause. The man had stopped moving. Instead, he stood near the back corner, his attention fixed on the blackboard. His eyes tracked across the equations she had written, his expression intense in a way that didn't match his role or his clothes. Sterling felt a flash of annoyance. Maintenance workers were supposed to be invisible to do their jobs without disrupting the educational mission that justified the university's existence. This man's obvious interest in her lecture was inappropriate, a boundary violation that suggested he didn't understand his place in the institutional hierarchy. She continued with her proof, trying to ignore his presence. But she kept noticing him in her peripheral vision, kept seeing him study the blackboard with that same intense focus. It was distracting, this janitor, who apparently thought he could understand graduate-level mathematics. When she reached the critical step in her proof, the moment where the argument turned on a subtle property of continuous functions, she made an error. A small one easily corrected the kind of computational mistake that happened sometimes when you were writing in real time before an audience. She substituted one variable for another, introducing an inconsistency that would propagate through the rest of the proof if left uncorrected. None of her students noticed. They continued copying into their notebooks, trusting that their professor's work was correct. But the janitor noticed. She saw him lean forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he examined the line where the error had occurred. His lips moved silently, as if working through the logic himself, and then his expression shifted just fractionally into something that looked like recognition. Sterling finished the proof feeling satisfied despite the small error. She would catch it during her review tonight, would send a correction email to the class. These things happen. Mathematics was difficult, and even experts sometimes made small mistakes. She was about to erase the board and move on to the next topic when the janitor stepped forward. The audacity of it shocked her into momentary silence. He approached the blackboard, his eyes still fixed on the proof, his whole body language suggesting that he had something to say. And that's when he spoke. That's when Jamal Washington, invisible maintenance worker, committed the unforgivable act of challenging Catherine Sterling's mathematical authority in front of her students. Actually, Professor, there's an error in your third line. The afternoon after the confrontation, Sterling sat in her office trying to focus on grant proposals, but finding her concentration fractured by memory. The janitor's observation had been correct. After the class emptied, after she had sent him away with a dismissive wave and a cold reminder that he should focus on his actual job, she had returned to the board and checked her work. The error was exactly where he had indicated. Line 3. She had indeed mixed up variables in a way that made the subsequent proof invalid. It took her 20 minutes to rework the equations to find the correct approach to restore logical consistency to her demonstration. 20 minutes to fix a mistake that a janitor had spotted in seconds. The implications of this were deeply troubling. Either he had gotten lucky, had noticed something obvious that happened to coincide with an actual error, or he possessed a level of mathematical sophistication that shouldn't exist in someone who cleaned toilets and emptied trash cans for a living. Sterling pulled up the university's employee directory on her computer, searching for information about Jamal Washington. The file was sparse, Hired 5 years ago. Assigned to facilities maintenance, primarily working evening shifts across 3 buildings. No disciplinary issues, no special commendations. Nothing that would explain how he had spotted an error in a graduate-level topology proof. She told herself it was a fluke, coincidence. Perhaps he had overheard graduate students discussing similar problems, had memorized some phrases without understanding their meaning, had simply parroted back something that happened to be relevant. Maintenance workers didn't study mathematics in their spare time. They didn't develop the kind of mathematical intuition required to spot subtle errors in real time. But a small voice in the back of her mind, a voice she tried hard to ignore, whispered that maybe her assumptions were wrong. Maybe intelligence didn't always wear the uniform she expected. Maybe brilliance could exist in places she had never thought to look. She pushed these thoughts away, irritated with herself for even entertaining them. The natural order existed for good reasons. People who possessed true intellectual gifts found ways to develop them, found paths to proper education and recognition. The system wasn't perfect, but it worked reasonably well at identifying and cultivating talent. Someone smart enough to do graduate mathematics would have found their way to graduate school, wouldn't be working night shifts as a janitor. Unless something had prevented them, unless circumstances had intervened in ways that had nothing to do with ability. Sterling stood and walked to her window, looking out over the campus she had conquered through sheer force of will. She thought about her own path to this office, this position, this life. Thought about the obstacles she had overcome, the doors she had forced open, the people who had tried to stop her. But she had advantages: a middle-class background, parents who valued education, no dependents to support, health insurance, financial aid and scholarships that made graduate school possible, a network of mentors who saw her potential and helped her navigate the system. What about someone without those advantages? Someone brilliant but poor, someone with family obligations, someone who had to work multiple jobs just to survive. How would they pursue their intellectual gifts? Where would they find the time, the resources, the access to education that required both money and leisure? She shook her head, annoyed with herself for this line of thinking. Dwelling on hypotheticals was pointless. The janitor had gotten lucky, had spotted an obvious mistake, had spoken out of turn. That was all. There was no deeper meaning, no challenge to the fundamental assumptions that structured her worldview. Her phone buzzed, Marcus again, this time calling rather than texting. Catherine, I just got off a call with Harrison Webb. He mentioned your department is doing that Euler's Challenge competition next week. Yes, I'm head judge again. Why Harrison's concerned about maintaining standards. Apparently, there's been some social media chatter about opening it to non-students. Sterling's jaw tightened. Harrison Webb, Marcus's colleague at Harvard, was an old-school mathematician who made Sterling look progressive. He believed firmly that mathematical ability correlated directly with traditional credentials, that anyone without a proper pedigree wasn't worth considering. The rules technically allow any university personnel to enter, but realistically, it requires years of graduate-level training. I'm not worried about maintenance workers trying to compete. Even as she said it, an image flashed through her mind. The janitor standing in her classroom, eyes fixed on her proof with that intense focus. Good. Harrison was worried that Whitmore might be lowering standards for some misguided diversity initiative. I told him you wouldn't allow that. Of course not. Excellence has no room for compromise. After the call ended, Sterling found herself thinking about the Euler's Challenge with new unease. The competition would attract the best graduate students from across campus, would showcase mathematical talent at its finest. But what if the janitor decided to enter? What if he showed up at registration thinking his lucky guess in her classroom qualified him to compete against Harvard PhDs and MIT researchers? The thought was almost amusing. Almost, but underneath the amusement lurked something else, something that felt uncomfortably like fear. Jamal Washington's day began at 4 in the afternoon when most people were starting to think about leaving work. He woke in a small apartment 6 miles from campus, a third-floor walk-up, in a building that had been old when his grandmother was young. The rent was $700 per month, which was criminally cheap by New England standards, and still represented nearly half his income from the maintenance job. He made coffee in a machine he had bought used from Goodwill, toasted bread that was one day past its sell-by date, checked his mother's medication schedule on the calendar, tacked to his refrigerator. She was doing better this month, the new treatment showing promising results, but the bills kept coming. Even with Medicare covering some of it, the copays and uncovered expenses added up to amounts that made his stomach clench when he thought about them too directly. $500 due next week for the oncology appointment, $300 for the new prescription the doctor had added, $200 for the nutritionist because the insurance company had decided that was elective rather than necessary, plus rent, plus utilities, plus food, plus gas for the car that was held together mostly through prayer and mechanical improvisation. The mathematics textbook on his kitchen table was 8 years old, bought used from a campus bookstore for $12. He had been working through Chapter 17 the night before studying spectral theory and functional analysis material that would be covered in second-year graduate courses if he were still enrolled in a mathematics program instead of cleaning buildings where mathematics was taught. He thought about MIT sometimes, though he tried not to dwell on it. Thought about the life he had been building there, the research he had been conducting, the future that had seemed so clear and achievable. 3 years into his PhD program, publications under his belt, an advisor who believed in him, a dissertation topic that excited him every time he thought about it. And then his mother's diagnosis. Stage 3 breast cancer, aggressive, requiring immediate treatment. She was alone in Boston, having moved there to be near him after his father died. No siblings to share the burden, no other family members who could step in and help. Just Jamal, who suddenly had to choose between his degree and his mother's life. It hadn't felt like a choice, not really. He had taken a leave of absence, intending to return once her treatment was finished. But treatment had complications, had led to more treatment, had required his constant presence in ways that made maintaining a graduate school schedule impossible. His advisor, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, had understood, had told him the program would be waiting when he was ready to return, had written recommendations for temporary jobs that might sustain him while he figured things out. But temporary had become semi-permanent, and semi-permanent had drifted toward permanent. His mother's cancer had gone into remission, then returned, then gone into remission again. The cycle of treatment and recovery and fear and hope had stretched from months into years. And somewhere in that stretch, the path back to MIT had become overgrown with obstacles that seemed increasingly insurmountable. He still studied, couldn't not study really. Mathematics had been part of his identity for so long that abandoning it felt like amputating a limb. He worked through textbooks in the hours between his 3 jobs, solved problems in notebooks he kept hidden behind cleaning supplies in his locker, thought through proofs while he mopped floors and emptied trash cans in buildings where people pursued the kind of research he should have been doing. The irony wasn't lost on him. He cleaned the mathematics building at Whitmore, wiped down chalkboards, where professors wrote equations he could solve in his sleep, emptied trash cans filled with failed problem sets from students who had access to resources he could only dream about. He was invisible to them, human furniture no more noteworthy than the desks they sat in or the lights that illuminated their work. Usually he accepted this invisibility, welcomed it even. It allowed him to exist in the mathematics building without explanation, to observe lectures during his cleaning rounds, to see how other people approach problems and prove theorems. He had learned to appreciate the privilege of being ignored, the freedom that came from being dismissed as intellectually irrelevant. But sometimes the injustice of it burned in his chest like acid. Like today, sitting in his apartment reading about spectral theory in a textbook, while students who didn't care half as much as he did attended seminars and asked questions and built careers. Like yesterday when that Professor Sterling had looked at him like he was something unpleasant, tracked in on someone's shoe, had told him to get out of her classroom as if his very presence contaminated the space. He had noticed her error immediately, couldn't help noticing it. His mind worked that way, spotting patterns and inconsistencies automatically, a cognitive reflex he couldn't turn off even if he wanted to. Line 3 of her proof had introduced a substitution that didn't preserve the necessary properties, had created a logical gap that invalidated everything that followed. Part of him had wanted to stay silent, had understood that speaking up would mark him as presumptuous, would cross boundaries that weren't meant to be crossed by people in his position. But another part, the part that still thought of himself as a mathematician, despite the Navy coveralls, couldn't let it stand. Couldn't watch her complete a proof that was fundamentally flawed and say nothing. So he had spoken, had pointed out the error, and had been rewarded with exactly the response he should have anticipated. Dismissal, contempt. The clear message that his input was neither wanted nor valued, that he should remember his place and stick to his actual job. He pushed the memory away, finished his coffee, pulled on his work uniform. The first shift started at 5 cleaning academic buildings before evening classes began. Then a break from 8 to 9. Then the main shift from 9 until 2 in the morning, covering 3 buildings across campus. If he was lucky, he could grab 4 hours of sleep before his morning job at the warehouse started at 7. This was his life now. This was what remained of the promising graduate student who had published 2 papers before his 25th birthday, who had impressed his MIT professors with his intuitive grasp of complex mathematics, who had dreamed of contributing to the field he loved. But dreams were luxuries, and he had responsibilities. Sterling's lecture 2 days after the confrontation drew a smaller crowd than usual. A few students had apparently decided that advanced topology wasn't worth their time, preferring to take the grade hit rather than wrestle with material that bent their minds into uncomfortable shapes. She didn't mind. The students who remained were the serious ones, the ones who might actually contribute something meaningful to mathematics if they stuck with it long enough. She worked through a proof about compact spaces, her chalk moving across the blackboard, with the confidence of someone who had taught this material a dozen times. The logic unfolded cleanly, each step, building naturally on the previous one, the whole structure, elegant in its completeness. But she found herself hesitating before she wrote each line, double-checking her work more carefully than usual. The janitor's correction had shaken her confidence in ways she didn't want to examine too closely. She kept thinking about his eyes, the way they had tracked across her proof with clear comprehension, the certainty in his voice when he pointed out her error. Halfway through class, she heard the familiar squeak of wheels. Her shoulders tensed involuntarily. The maintenance worker was making his rounds again, pushing his cart along the side wall, his presence a distraction she didn't need. But this time she forced herself not to look, not to acknowledge him. He was doing his job, and she was doing hers, and those jobs didn't intersect in any meaningful way. Whatever had happened before was an anomaly, a fluke, nothing worth dwelling on. She finished the proof and turned to face her students. Any questions? A hand rose in the middle section. Sarah Mitchell, her star student, looking puzzled. Professor Sterling in line 7. When you apply the lemma about continuous functions, doesn't that require the domain to be connected? I'm not sure we established that property earlier. Sterling looked back at the board, tracing through the logic. Sarah was right. She had skipped a step, had assumed a property that needed to be verified. It wasn't a fatal error. The proof could be fixed easily, but it was sloppy. Good catch, Sarah. Let me add that verification. She turned back to the board, beginning to write the necessary argument. But before she could finish the first line, another voice spoke from the back of the room. Professor Sterling, there's actually a simpler way to handle that issue. She froze. The voice belonged to the janitor. Again. He had spoken from his position by the far wall, his tone respectful but firm, his words cutting through the classroom protocol like a knife through silk. The students turned in their seats, staring at this unprecedented interruption. A few looked confused, wondering who this person was and why he thought he had the right to speak during a lecture. Others looked amused, anticipating entertainment at the expense of an overconfident maintenance worker. Sterling slowly set down her chalk. Her hand trembled slightly, anger rising hot in her chest. She turned to face him, her expression carefully controlled, despite the fury building beneath the surface. "Excuse me," Jamal stepped away from his cart, moving into the aisle between seats. His movement was calm, unthreatening, but his presence suddenly dominated the room in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. Instead of verifying that the domain is connected, you could use the alternative formulation of the lemma that works for arbitrary topological spaces. It's actually stronger and makes the rest of the proof cleaner. The silence that followed was absolute. Sterling felt 30 pairs of eyes watching her, waiting to see how she would respond to this challenge from an impossible source. Her mind raced through the mathematics, checking whether what he said was correct, and realized with sinking certainty that it was. There was indeed an alternative version of the lemma, one that didn't require the connectedness assumption. Using it would simplify the proof, would eliminate the extra verification step she had been about to add. It was the kind of insight that came from deep familiarity with the material, from understanding not just the mechanics of proofs, but their underlying structure. This is a classroom for enrolled students. Sterling's voice came out colder than she intended. If you're not enrolled, you need to leave. Now. Jamal held her gaze for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slightly, turned back to his cart, and wheeled it toward the door. The squeak of the wheels seemed deafening in the continued silence. After he left, Sterling stood frozen at the board. She should continue the proof, should restore her authority through sheer competence. But her hands weren't quite steady, and her thoughts kept circling back to the same troubling question. How did a janitor know alternative formulations of advanced topology lemmas? Sarah raised her hand again, her expression carefully neutral. Professor, should we use the alternative formulation he mentioned? It does seem simpler. Sterling felt trapped. Accepting the janitor's suggestion would validate his interruption, would acknowledge that he had contributed something valuable. But denying it would be intellectually dishonest, would prioritize her ego over mathematical truth. She made her choice, hating every second of it. Yes, let's use the alternative version. As she worked through the revised proof using the approach that the janitor had suggested, she felt something shift inside her. The wall she had built around her understanding of intelligence, around her assumptions about who deserved to be in rooms like this, developed tiny cracks. Not enough to crumble, not yet, but enough to let in slivers of uncomfortable light. The announcement of the Euler's Challenge came 3 days later, delivered in a packed auditorium that buzzed with excitement. Sterling stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces, feeling the weight of institutional prestige resting on her shoulders. This competition mattered. It represented Whitmore's commitment to mathematical excellence, its place among elite academic institutions, its ability to identify and cultivate the brightest minds. She had prepared remarks that emphasized rigor and standards that made clear what kind of intellectual sophistication the competition would demand. Her voice carried across the auditorium with practiced authority as she described the three-round structure, the escalating difficulty, the prestigious prize awaiting the winner. $50,000 in automatic PhD admission to any participating university. This represents the pinnacle of mathematical achievement at the graduate level. She paused, letting the magnitude sink in. In the audience, she saw ambitious graduate students leaning forward, already calculating their chances. These were her people, properly educated, rigorously trained, equipped with the tools that years of formal study provided. A hand rose near the middle. Derek Carter, a Harvard graduate student, spending a semester at Whitmore as a visiting researcher. Sterling nodded at him. Professor Sterling, can all university personnel enter the competition? The question was innocent enough, but something in his tone suggested he wasn't asking purely theoretically. Sterling's eyes scanned the auditorium, wondering if the janitor was somewhere in the crowd. She didn't see him, but that meant nothing. He worked evening shifts. He could be anywhere. Technically, yes. The rules allow any current university personnel to register. She let the word technically hang in the air, weighted with meaning. Then she continued, her voice taking on an edge that anyone paying attention would recognize as warning. However, advanced mathematics requires years of formal training. The problems in this competition will demand deep knowledge of graduate-level material. We wouldn't want anyone to embarrass themselves publicly by attempting something far beyond their preparation. Her gaze swept the room, making eye contact with faculty members who nodded approvingly. The message was clear. This competition was for serious mathematicians, for people with PhDs or working toward PhDs, for individuals whose credentials demonstrated their right to compete, not for janitors. Let me demonstrate the level of sophistication required. She turned to the large blackboard behind the podium and wrote out an integration problem. It looked relatively straightforward at first glance, a definite integral of a function involving trigonometric expressions. But anyone with real mathematical training would recognize the subtlety hidden in its apparent simplicity. This requires advanced techniques, integration by parts, clever substitutions, and sophisticated manipulation of trigonometric identities. Anyone unable to solve this within, say, 15 minutes probably shouldn't waste our time with the actual competition. The audience stirred as students pulled out notebooks and began working. The room filled with the soft sounds of pen on paper, of whispered consultations between classmates, of the quiet intensity of people engaged in mathematical problem solving. Sterling watched them work, feeling satisfied. This was how mathematics education should function. Properly prepared students applying methods they had learned through systematic instruction, building on foundations laid by years of prerequisite coursework. The natural order maintained. After 10 minutes, hands began rising, students who had arrived at solutions eager to demonstrate their competence. Sterling called on a few listening as they explained their approaches. The methods varied slightly, but all followed similar patterns. Integration by parts to handle the products of functions. Substitution to simplify the trigonometric expressions. Careful evaluation of resulting integrals. All correct, all adequate, all exactly what she had expected from graduate students with proper training. She was about to erase the board and conclude her demonstration when a voice spoke from the back of the auditorium. A voice she had heard too many times in the past week. A voice that sent a spike of adrenaline through her system even before her conscious mind registered who was speaking. Professor Sterling, there's a more elegant approach using symmetry properties. Every head in the auditorium turned. The crowd parted slightly, revealing Jamal Washington standing near the rear exit. He still wore his maintenance uniform, still carried himself with that same quiet dignity that somehow made the coveralls irrelevant. But now he was walking forward, moving down the center aisle toward the front of the room. Sterling's hand tightened on the chalk she was holding. She felt hundreds of eyes on her, felt the weight of the moment, felt her carefully constructed authority beginning to slip. "Oh, really?" Her voice dripped condescension, each syllable precisely calibrated to remind him and everyone else watching of his place, his role, his presumption in speaking at all. "Please, enlighten us with your insights." She stepped away from the board, gesturing toward it with exaggerated courtesy. Part of her hoped he would back down, would recognize the social pressure she was applying, and retreat to the safety of silence. But a larger part she didn't want to acknowledge needed to see what he would do. Needed to know if this janitor who had twice corrected her mathematics could actually demonstrate the sophistication his intervention suggested. Jamal reached the front of the auditorium. He picked up a piece of chalk from the tray beneath the blackboard, his hand steady despite the weight of attention focused on him. Then he turned to the board and began to write. His handwriting was crisp, professional, surprisingly elegant for someone who supposedly cleaned floors for a living. He worked quickly but not hastily, each symbol placed with the kind of confidence that came from deep familiarity with mathematical notation. Instead of following the lengthy approaches the students had used, he wrote a series of transformations that exploited the symmetry of the trigonometric functions. Where others had attacked the problem through brute force computation, he revealed an underlying structure that made the integral collapse into something almost trivial. By recognizing that this integral has mirror symmetry around the midpoint of its domain, we can transform it into a much simpler form. The same answer, but with half the work. He stepped back from the board. The transformation he had written out showed why the integral evaluated to its particular value revealed the mathematical reason rather than just computing through mechanical application of techniques. It was beautiful in the way that good mathematics should be beautiful, elegant, and insightful, and deeply satisfying. The auditorium erupted in spontaneous applause. Not universal, not overwhelming, but genuine. A scattering of graduate students who recognized what they had just witnessed, who appreciated the difference between competent calculation and mathematical insight. Sterling felt her face flush. The applause died quickly under her withering stare, students remembering where they were and who held power in this room. But the damage was done. The janitor had demonstrated before hundreds of witnesses that he possessed sophistication that shouldn't exist outside formal academic training. Her competitive nature flared, threatened by this unexpected challenge. In a moment she would later recognize as reckless, driven by confusion and unwilling fascination, she strode to the blackboard and erased the integration problem. In its place, she wrote something much more difficult. The equation came from her own doctoral research, a complex differential equation that had taken her weeks to solve even with her advisor's guidance. It involved nonlinear terms, unusual boundary conditions, and required advanced techniques from multiple areas of mathematics. She had chosen it specifically because solving it should be impossible for anyone without years of graduate training in differential equations. She turned to face Jamal, her voice carrying across the now silent auditorium. "Fine, if you think you're so mathematically gifted." The words came out before her rational mind could stop them, before she fully considered the implications, before she recognized how personal this had become. Solve this equation and I'll marry you. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. The joke was clearly intended to humiliate, to reduce his presumptuous challenge to absurdity. Everyone understood the subtext. This problem was impossible for him. He would try and fail, would reveal the limits of his lucky guesses, would be exposed as an amateur, pretending to sophistication he didn't possess. But Jamal didn't laugh. He stared at the equation for 30 seconds that stretched like hours. His eyes moved across the symbols, his lips moving silently, as if working through the logic internally. And Sterling, watching him with a mixture of dread and anticipation, saw something shift in his expression. Saw the moment when the problem clicked, when its structure became clear to him, when he understood what needed to be done. Then he stepped forward and began to write. What happens when your certainty cracks? When the foundations of everything you believe shift beneath your feet? When someone you dismissed as irrelevant demonstrates that your assumptions were built on prejudice rather than truth? Catherine Sterling is about to find out. Jamal's chalk moved across the blackboard with methodical precision. He started by identifying what type of differential equations Sterling had written, classifying it according to properties that determined which solution methods would work. The symbols flowed from his hand in logical progression, each line building on the previous one, the whole argument unfolding like a story with inevitable conclusions. Sterling watched her initial confidence beginning to erode. He wasn't guessing, wasn't fumbling through trial and error. He was systematically dismantling her problem using approaches that demonstrated genuine understanding of advanced differential equations. He chose separation of variables as his first technique, rewriting the equation in a form that isolated different terms. Then he applied a transformation that linearized the nonlinear components, a clever trick that required recognizing hidden structure in the equation's form. His work showed not just mechanical application of formulas, but real mathematical intuition. Around the auditorium, students leaned forward to watch. The more advanced ones, those who had seen similar equations in their own coursework, began to recognize what was happening. Whispered conversations broke out. Is he actually solving it? Where did he learn to do that? Who is this guy? Sterling felt heat rising in her face. She had designed this moment to expose him, to reveal the limits of his understanding, to restore the natural order she believed in. Instead, she was watching him demonstrate sophistication that matched or exceeded her graduate students. After 4 minutes, he had produced a complete solution. Not just an answer, but a full derivation showing every step, explaining every technique, making clear why the approach worked. He set down the chalk and turned to face her. Professor Sterling, the solution checks out. Would you like me to verify the boundary conditions? His voice was quiet, respectful even. There was no triumph in his tone, no smugness, no attempt to humiliate her the way she had tried to humiliate him. Just straightforward presentation of mathematical truth, offered without malice or agenda. The auditorium had gone completely silent. Hundreds of people held their breath, waiting to see how Sterling would respond. She stepped forward, moving to the blackboard, her mind still struggling to process what she was seeing. She checked his work line by line. Every step was correct. Every logical leap was justified. Every technique was applied appropriately. The solution matched her own research, exactly arrived at through methods that demonstrated deep comprehension rather than rote memorization. Lucky guess. Her voice came out lacking its usual confidence, the words hollow even as she spoke them. She was grasping for explanations that would preserve her worldview, that would explain away what had just happened without forcing her to reconsider fundamental assumptions. One problem doesn't prove mathematical maturity. Anyone can memorize techniques without understanding theory. But even as she said it, she knew it was false. No one memorized this. The approach he had used required understanding relationships between different areas of mathematics, required the ability to recognize which tools would work in which situations, required years of experience solving similar problems. A voice spoke from the side of the auditorium. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, visiting from Stanford as a guest lecturer for the semester. Sterling had met her once at a conference, had been impressed by her research and her reputation. Rodriguez stood now, her expression thoughtful. That was quite impressive, Mr. Washington. Jamal Washington. Mr. Washington, your method was both rigorous and insightful. That's not something one picks up casually. Sterling's jaw tightened. Having another professor praise the janitor in public in front of students and colleagues threatened everything she had built her career on. Her authority, her expertise, her right to judge who belonged in mathematical spaces. "Since you're so confident, Mr. Washington," Sterling's voice carried barely controlled frustration, each word sharp with an edge she usually reserved for incompetent students. "I officially invite you to enter the Euler's Challenge. But when you fail publicly, remember I tried to spare you the embarrassment." The gauntlet was thrown, the battle lines drawn. In that moment, standing in front of hundreds of witnesses, Catherine Sterling committed herself to a course of action that would transform both their lives in ways neither could predict. Jamal held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once, a simple gesture that somehow conveyed both acceptance and understanding of everything riding on this competition. "I'll register tomorrow." He turned and walked back up the aisle, leaving his cleaning cart forgotten near the side wall. The crowd parted to let him through, students staring at him with new eyes, seeing him for the first time as something other than invisible maintenance staff. Sterling stood alone at the front of the auditorium, next to the blackboard covered in equations that proved her wrong. Her carefully constructed world was beginning to crack small fissures, spreading through the foundation of her assumptions. She didn't know it yet, but those cracks would soon become canyons. That evening, alone in her office, Sterling sat in darkness, looking out over the campus. The lights of academic buildings glowed against the night sky, each window representing someone pursuing knowledge, someone contributing to the great human endeavor of understanding the world through systematic inquiry. She had built her life around the belief that this pursuit required structure, required institutions and credentials and systematic training, required the kind of rigorous education that only formal programs could provide. The idea that someone could bypass all of this, could achieve genuine mathematical sophistication through sheer determination and talent, threatened the legitimacy of everything she had worked for. If Jamal Washington could master graduate mathematics while working as a janitor, what did that say about the value of her Harvard PhD? What did it mean about the years she had spent in seminars and qualifying exams? If brilliance could emerge from anywhere from anyone regardless of their access to elite institutions, then what separated her from the people she had dismissed as intellectually inferior? Her phone buzzed. "Marcus calling from Harvard. Catherine, I just heard from several colleagues about what happened at your competition announcement. Is it true that a maintenance worker challenged you?" Sterling closed her eyes, fighting against the humiliation of having her professional life become gossip fodder. He solved a problem. One problem. "It doesn't mean anything. Harrison Webb says you invited him to compete." "Catherine, surely you understand how this looks. The optics of allowing clearly unqualified personnel to enter a prestigious competition." He solved a differential equation from my doctoral research, Marcus, in 5 minutes, in front of 400 people. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough to make Sterling wonder if the connection had dropped. "That's impossible. I watched him do it. Then he must have seen the problem before, must have had access to your published work." "Catherine, people like that don't develop advanced mathematical skills spontaneously. There has to be an explanation." Sterling wanted to believe this, wanted to embrace any explanation that preserved the order she understood. But she had watched Jamal's approach too carefully, had seen the way he thought through the problem in real time. That wasn't memorization. That was genuine mathematical thinking. "I should go. I have papers to review." She ended the call before Marcus could say more, before his voice could reinforce doubts she was already struggling with. Then she opened her laptop and searched for Jamal Washington online, looking for any information that might explain his abilities. She found nothing. No academic publications, no university records beyond his employment file, no trace of mathematical training anywhere in the digital record. He existed in the databases as a maintenance worker, nothing more. His past before Whitmore was essentially blank. The mystery deepened her frustration. She needed an explanation, needed something that would make sense of what she had witnessed. But every avenue she explored led nowhere, left her with more questions than answers. Finally, exhausted and confused, she shut down her computer and prepared to leave. But before she did, she pulled out her notes for the Euler's Challenge and began revising her plans. The problems she had originally selected were difficult, certainly designed to challenge strong graduate students. But they weren't difficult enough. Not anymore. Not when she needed to prove a point, needed to expose the limits of self-education and natural talent. She began designing new problems pulling from the most technical areas of mathematics she knew: complex analysis, differential topology, functional analysis. Each problem carefully crafted to require the kind of specialized knowledge that came only from years of formal graduate training. If Jamal Washington wanted to compete with properly educated mathematicians, she would give him exactly the challenge he had asked for. And when he failed, when he revealed that his lucky guesses couldn't substitute for systematic education, the natural order would be restored. She worked late into the night, her office the only lit window in the mathematics building, in designing problems that would separate authentic mathematical maturity from enthusiastic amateurism. Each equation she wrote felt like a fortification, a barrier that would protect the world she understood from the chaos of unpredictable brilliance. But even as she worked, a small voice whispered in the back of her mind, what if he succeeds? What if his solutions to these problems are as elegant and insightful as his previous work? What if everything you believe about intelligence and education and merit is wrong? She pushed the voice away, focusing on the mathematics. Numbers didn't lie. Equations didn't have agendas. The competition would reveal truth regardless of what she wanted that truth to be. Across campus, in a small apartment 6 miles from the university, Jamal Washington sat at his kitchen table studying. He had worked his evening shift, had cleaned 3 buildings, had finished at 2 in the morning. Now, instead of sleeping, he was preparing for a competition that could change everything. The medical bills sat in a pile next to his textbooks, a reminder of why this mattered. $50,000 could transform his mother's treatment, could provide access to experimental therapies that insurance wouldn't cover, could buy time and hope and possibility. But more than money was at stake. He had spent 5 years invisible, had accepted his relegation to the margins of the mathematical world, had made peace with the sacrifice his mother's illness required. But Sterling's challenge had awakened something in him that had been dormant, something that remembered what it felt like to be recognized for his mind rather than dismissed for his uniform. He wanted this. Wanted to prove that his years of solitary study had value, that the sacrifice of his MIT degree hadn't destroyed his potential, that brilliance could survive even in the most inhospitable circumstances. But he knew what he was up against. Sterling would design problems specifically to defeat him, would use every advantage her position and credentials provided. She would make the competition as difficult as possible, would create barriers designed to require exactly the kind of resources and training he didn't have. He would have to be better than good, would have to be exceptional, would have to demonstrate the kind of mathematical insight that transcended formal education. The question was whether 5 years of cleaning floors had dulled his edge, whether the time away from formal mathematics had cost him the fluency he once possessed. There was only one way to find out. He opened his textbook and began to study his small lamp, the only light in the apartment, working problems while the rest of the city slept. Two people separated by every imaginable barrier of class and circumstance, preparing for a confrontation that would force both to reconsider everything they thought they knew about intelligence and about worth, about the distance between human beings who should have been equals, but had been sorted by systems neither fully understood. The Euler's challenge would be their battlefield. But the real contest was already underway, fought in offices and apartments, in assumptions and doubts, in the space between what the world told them was possible and what their collision was about to reveal. Registration for the Euler's challenge opened on a Wednesday morning that felt like any other until it didn't. The mathematics department's administrative office expected perhaps 20 applicants, maybe 30, if word had spread beyond the usual graduate student networks. Instead, by 9:30, a line stretched down the hallway and around the corner, filled with curious onlookers as much as serious candidates. Jamal arrived during his lunch break from the warehouse job, still wearing steel-toed boots and a shirt with the company logo embroidered above the pocket. The stairs followed him down the corridor, whispers trailing in his wake like smoke. He recognized the pattern by now, had lived with it for 5 years. Invisible until he did something that made invisibility impossible, then suddenly hypervisible in ways that felt like exposure rather than recognition. The registration form was simple enough: name, university affiliation, educational background. His pen hovered over that last field, uncertain how much truth to reveal. Eventually, he wrote some graduate coursework and left it vague, unwilling to explain MIT, or Dr. Rodriguez, or the life he had abandoned to sit beside hospital beds and hold his mother's hand through chemotherapy. Sterling conducted the preliminary screening personally, an unusual choice for a department head, but one that made perfect sense given what was at stake. She sat behind a desk in a small conference room, her expression professionally neutral, as candidates entered one by one to solve three qualifying problems under her direct observation. The first 11 candidates were exactly what she expected. Graduate students from prestigious programs, their solutions technically correct if occasionally clumsy, their credentials impeccable enough to justify admission to the main competition. Then Jamal entered, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. She handed him the problem sheet without comment, her eyes challenging him to prove the auditorium incident hadn't been luck. The three problems escalated in difficulty, designed to expose gaps in informal education. But as Jamal worked through them at the whiteboard, provided something unexpected happened. For the first problem, while other candidates had worked through lengthy calculations to find a function's maximum value, under constraints, Jamal used geometric reasoning. He drew a simple diagram showing two curves touching at a single point, the solution visible in the relationship between their shapes. The answer emerged from visual intuition rather than algebraic manipulation. Sterling found herself leaning forward despite her determination to remain detached. His approach was elegant in ways that revealed deep understanding, the kind that came from seeing mathematics as interconnected ideas rather than isolated techniques. The second problem involved a special matrix with unusual properties. Graduate students had worked through complex formulas, setting up and solving systems of equations. Jamal stared at the matrix for perhaps 30 seconds, then wrote down the answer directly. He had recognized a pattern in its structure, had seen a relationship that made computation unnecessary. When I look at this matrix, the symmetry tells me everything I need to know. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic, as if understanding things quickly was something to feel guilty about. Sterling made notes on her evaluation form with sharp, angry strokes. The third problem was a famous historical question about infinite series, something that had challenged mathematicians for centuries before being solved by the great Leonhard Euler himself. Most candidates attempted various advanced techniques they had learned in coursework, applying modern tools to attack an old problem. Jamal did something different. He explained Euler's original approach from the 18th century, demonstrating not just mathematical ability, but historical knowledge that suggested extensive self-directed study. His explanation made the classical method feel fresh, relevant, connected to modern mathematics in ways that honored the past while illuminating the present. Sterling set down her pen when he finished. The three solutions weren't just correct. They were consistently more elegant than those produced by PhD candidates from Harvard and MIT, revealing a depth of mathematical maturity that shouldn't exist outside formal training. All candidates pass. Her announcement came out clipped professional, betraying none of the turmoil underneath. But alone after the last applicant left, she sat in the empty conference room, staring at Jamal's solutions until the cleaning staff arrived for evening rounds. The internet discovered the story that night. Someone in the auditorium had recorded video of Jamal solving Sterling's differential equation, had posted it with the caption, "Janitor School's Math Professor." The clip went viral, with frightening speed racking up 1 million views in 6 hours, spawning reaction videos and think pieces and Twitter threads that dissected every element of the confrontation. By morning, Janitor Genius was trending internationally. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as feel-good inspiration or damning indictment of educational inequality, depending on their editorial stance. Sterling's email inbox filled with messages ranging from supportive to vicious, her professional reputation suddenly entangled with larger cultural conversations about merit and access. But the real explosion came during round one of the actual competition, held 3 days later in the same auditorium where everything had started. 1,200 people packed the space with overflow crowds watching on screens set up in adjacent buildings. The live stream audience had grown to 40,000 numbers that shocked university administrators who had expected modest local interest. The elimination problem appeared on the main screen, deceptively simple in its phrasing. Prove that the sum of the first n odd numbers always equals n squared. Most contestants attacked it with formal mathematical proofs, writing elaborate logical arguments, using induction or algebraic manipulation. They followed prescribed academic methods, their solutions textbook perfect examples of how graduate students approach problems. Sarah Mitchell's proof was particularly polished each line, following inexorably from the previous one, the whole argument rigorous and complete. Derek Carter's approach used slightly different techniques, but arrived at the same conclusion through equally valid reasoning. The other contestants produced similar work, all technically correct, all demonstrating competence. Then Jamal's turn came to present his solution. He walked to the main whiteboard carrying colored chalk, and instead of writing equations, he began drawing dots. The pattern emerged quickly. One dot for the first odd number. Three more dots arranged around it to make a 2 by 2 square for the sum of the first two odd numbers. Five more dots extending the pattern to create a 3 by 3 square. The visual proof was instant and beautiful, something anyone in the audience could understand regardless of mathematical training. Look at how the odd numbers build perfect squares naturally. His voice carried clearly through the microphone, calm and certain. Each dot represented one unit, and the pattern showed visually what equations could only describe abstractly. Adding odd numbers created larger and larger perfect squares through geometric growth that was immediately obvious once you saw it. The audience reaction was electric. People who had struggled with mathematics their entire lives suddenly understood a fundamental truth that had always seemed opaque. The live stream chat exploded with comments from viewers worldwide experiencing genuine mathematical insight for the first time. De Rodriguez stood and applauded her professional reserve breaking under the weight of authentic admiration. This level of mathematical communication, this ability to make complex ideas accessible without sacrificing rigor, was vanishingly rare. Absolutely brilliant. That's real mathematical insight, not just mechanical computation. Sterling's jaw clenched so hard it hurt. Visual proofs were perfectly valid mathematics. She knew that intellectually. But watching the audience respond to Jamal's presentation with such enthusiasm felt like betrayal, as if they were rewarding simplicity over sophistication. Mr. Washington's approach is creative. Her voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut. But advanced mathematics requires more than pictures. Real mathematical theory demands rigorous formal methods. The dismissive tone fooled no one. Everyone watching understood she felt threatened, could see the fear beneath her professional facade. And the more she tried to minimize his achievement, the more her insecurity became apparent to millions of observers. All 12 contestants advanced to the semifinals, but the energy clearly favored Jamal's innovative solution over mechanical textbook approaches. During the break, social media erupted with renewed intensity. Art students began creating variations on his visual proof, turning mathematics into aesthetic objects. Teachers shared the video in classrooms, using it to help students who had always felt excluded from mathematical understanding. The romantic shippers emerged in force, creating Sterling Washington hashtags and writing elaborate fan fiction about the brilliant professor and mysterious maintenance worker. The tension between them was obvious even to casual observers, the kind of charged dynamic that suggested either hatred or attraction, or possibly both simultaneously. University board members arrived to observe what had become an international phenomenon. Major donors wanted reassurance that Whitmore's reputation was being enhanced rather than damaged. Local news crews set up permanent positions outside the mathematics building, interviewing students about their perspectives on talent and education. And through it all, Sterling felt control slipping through her fingers like water. This was supposed to be her moment, her competition, her opportunity to showcase mathematical excellence according to standards she understood. Instead, it had become a referendum on everything she believed about intelligence and worth. Jamal's life outside the competition consisted of brutal arithmetic that left no room for error. His mother's next oncology appointment required $500 he didn't have yet. The experimental treatment her doctor recommended cost $8,000 that insurance had denied coverage for the rejection letter, using bureaucratic language to explain why keeping someone alive wasn't medically necessary. He worked the warehouse shift from 7 to 3, loading trucks and operating forklifts, his body performing repetitive tasks while his mind rehearsed proofs and theorems. The other warehouse workers knew nothing about his mathematics, saw him as just another guy trying to make rent and keep his head above water. Their conversations during breaks covered sports and relationships and complaints about management, ordinary concerns of ordinary people living ordinary lives. Then the university shift from 6 to 2, cleaning academic buildings while students and faculty pursued the kind of intellectual work he had sacrificed. He had developed systems for efficiency, could empty an entire lecture hall's worth of trash cans in under 8 minutes, could mop 3 floors in 40 minutes if he didn't stop to rest. But he did stop sometimes, usually around midnight, when the buildings were empty, except for occasional graduate students working late. He would pause outside classrooms where blackboards still held the residue of afternoon lectures, would study whatever fragments of mathematics remained visible. Once he found a beautiful proof of the spectral theorem written in a clear, careful hand. He stood there for 20 minutes working through the logic, appreciating the elegance of the argument. The third job was sporadic weekend shifts at a tutoring center where he helped high school students prepare for standardized tests. The irony of this was almost funny. He taught calculus and algebra to teenagers who saw mathematics as obstacle rather than wonder, who wanted tricks and shortcuts instead of understanding. But the $75 per session added up. So he smiled and explained derivative rules to kids who would forget everything by Monday. Sleep happened in the margins. 4 hours after the graveyard shift, if he was lucky, sometimes less if his mother needed him, sometimes not at all. If anxiety about money or the competition kept his mind churning. Coffee became less beverage than life support, consumed in quantities that probably weren't healthy but were absolutely necessary. The medical bills accumulated on his kitchen table like accusations. Each envelope contained another demand, another threat to send his account to collections, another reminder that American healthcare treated illness as moral failure worthy of financial punishment. He had applied for hardship programs, had filled out forms documenting his income and expenses in humiliating detail, had waited weeks for responses that ranged from inadequate to non-existent. $50,000 would change everything, would pay for the experimental treatment, would clear the existing debt, would buy time and hope and the possibility of his mother seeing him complete his PhD. The money alone would have been enough to justify competing, but something else drove him now. He needed to prove that the years of solitary study had value, that the sacrifice of his MIT degree hadn't destroyed his potential, that brilliance could survive even in the most inhospitable circumstances. Every problem he solved in the competition wasn't just mathematics, it was autobiography written in equations and proofs. Sterling's sabotage began subtly, an anonymous complaint to university security about inappropriate after-hours library access by non-academic personnel. Jamal arrived one evening to find his card access revoked. A security guard, explaining apologetically that facilities staff weren't permitted in academic libraries outside their assigned work hours. "I've been studying there for 3 years. His voice stayed level despite frustration burning in his chest. The guard shrugged, uncomfortable, but following orders that came from somewhere above his pay grade. "New policy, apparently. Sorry, man." The loss hurt more than seemed rational. The library had been his refuge, the one place where he could surround himself with books and ideas and the physical infrastructure of scholarship he had been forced to abandon. Studying in his apartment meant staring at medical bills and feeling the walls close in. The library had offered escape. He found new spaces, coffee shops that stayed open late, their wireless internet slow but functional. The break room at the warehouse during lunch, his textbooks hidden inside sports magazines so coworkers wouldn't ask questions. Even his car, sometimes parked under streetlights in empty lots, reading until his eyes burned and his neck cramped from the awkward angle. The media attacks came next, coordinated through channels that gave Sterling plausible deniability while serving her interests perfectly. Dr. Harrison Webb, her boyfriend's Harvard colleague, published an editorial questioning whether someone without proper qualifications belonged in serious mathematical discourse. This publicity stunt damages the integrity of higher education. Mathematical competence requires systematic training, not amateur theatrics. Allowing unqualified individuals to compete against serious scholars undermines the very foundations of academic rigor. The argument was dressed in concern for standards, but the subtext was clear. People like Jamal didn't belong in spaces reserved for credentialed elites. His presence contaminated the purity of academic competition, threatened the mechanisms that separated worthy from unworthy. Other academics piled on their statements, varying in harshness but unified in message. Mathematics was serious business that required serious preparation. Natural talent without formal education was romantic nonsense. The competition should be restricted to actual students pursuing actual degrees. But for every attack, a defense emerged. Mathematicians who remembered being dismissed themselves, who had overcome barriers to enter the field, who recognized brilliance when they saw it regardless of packaging. Teachers who had spent careers trying to make mathematics accessible, who saw Jamal's visual proofs as exactly the kind of communication their discipline needed. Students who felt inspired by someone proving that credentials weren't the only path to excellence. The battle lines formed across social media and academic listservs, arguments about talent and access and institutional gatekeeping playing out in real time. Whitmore's communications department scrambled to manage messaging, trying to position the university as both rigorous and inclusive, both demanding excellence and celebrating underdog stories. Through it all, Sterling maintained public neutrality while privately amplifying every criticism. She forwarded Harrison's editorial to colleagues with carefully worded messages about maintaining standards. She expressed concern in faculty meetings about the competition's integrity. She never said Jamal's name, never made explicit accusations, but her meaning was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Dr. Rodriguez watched this campaign with growing unease. She had started noticing patterns in Jamal's mathematical style that triggered memories she couldn't quite access. The way he approached problems, the elegance of his solutions, the particular techniques he favored, all felt familiar in ways that suggested they had met before. But when she tried to remember where or when the details slipped away like water through her fingers, she had advised dozens of doctoral students over her career. Could he have been one of them? The timeline would work if he had been at MIT during her tenure there. But wouldn't she remember someone this talented? The semifinals arrived with even more fanfare than round one. The auditorium was packed beyond capacity, every seat-filled standing room claimed hours before start time. The live stream audience had swollen to 75,000 viewers, worldwide numbers, that made this competition bigger than most academic conferences. 6 contestants remained. Sarah Mitchell Sterling's protege looked nervous but determined. Derek Carter maintained his Harvard confidence despite the pressure. The other 3 graduate students carried themselves with the careful poise of people who understood they were competing not just for prizes but for future career opportunities. And Jamal, exhausted from working a double shift the night before, looked like someone running on fumes and determination. The semi-final problem appeared on the screen, technical language that intimidated general audiences but spoke clearly to trained mathematicians. Determine the convergence properties of this infinite series and analyze its behavior. The equations involve complex functions, unusual limits, and the kind of subtle analysis that required graduate-level expertise. Most contestants applied memorized formulas, working through mechanical procedures they had learned in coursework. Their approaches were correct, but uninspired, the kind of competent mathematics that earned passing grades without revealing genuine insight. Jamal stared at the problem for 90 seconds, long enough that Sterling allowed herself a small smile of anticipated victory. Then he began drawing graphs on his whiteboard, simple curves that showed how the mathematical series behaved over time. Think of it like a bouncing ball. His voice carried across the silent auditorium, making complex analysis accessible through physical metaphor. Sometimes the bounces get smaller and eventually stop. Sometimes they get bigger and never end. The mathematics tells us which type of behavior we're dealing with. He showed how the series in question exhibited convergent behavior, settling into predictable patterns rather than spiraling out of control. His explanation made graduate-level material comprehensible to ordinary people while remaining completely rigorous. The auditorium erupted in applause that continued until Dr. Rodriguez stood and joined in, her face shining with something between admiration and dawning recognition. When she spoke, her voice carried unusual emotion. Extraordinary. This demonstrates the deepest possible understanding of mathematical principles. He's not just solving problems, he's revealing the beauty hidden within complex theory. Sterling felt the moment slipping away from her, again felt her carefully constructed competition becoming a referendum on Jamal's brilliance, rather than a test of formal preparation. The anger and frustration and unwilling attraction all tangled together in her chest until she could barely breathe. The results came swiftly. 3 contestants remained for the championship round: Sarah Mitchell, Derek Carter, and Jamal Washington. The janitor who refused to accept limitations had survived every challenge she had thrown at him, had demonstrated mathematical sophistication that matched or exceeded the best graduate students in the country. That evening, Sterling crafted her ultimate trap. She selected the problem from her own doctoral dissertation, the challenge that had consumed 3 years of her life with full university resources and expert guidance. If anything could expose the limits of self-education and natural talent, this would be it. She worked late into the night refining the problem statement, ensuring maximum difficulty while maintaining technical validity. This would require specialized knowledge from multiple graduate fields, would demand fluency with advanced techniques that took years to master properly. Tomorrow's final problem will require the deepest possible mathematical sophistication. Her announcement to assembled media carried satisfaction that bordered on vindictive. Only authentic mathematical maturity will suffice. But alone in her office afterwards, staring at equations that represented her greatest intellectual achievement, Sterling felt something unexpected. Not triumph at the trap she had set, but emptiness at what proving herself right would cost. Because somewhere in the past weeks, between confrontations and competitions and moments of unwilling respect, Jamal Washington had stopped being an abstraction to defeat and had become a person she was deliberately trying to destroy. And the realization that she was capable of such cruelty, that her prejudice could drive her to weaponize her expertise against someone who had done nothing wrong except challenge her assumptions, made her feel sick. She thought about withdrawing the problem, about choosing something fair instead of something designed specifically to crush him. But pride and fear and stubborn certainty that she must be right about how intelligence worked drove her forward. She finalized the championship challenge and sent it to the competition committee with instructions to display it exactly as written. Across campus, Jamal sat in his car outside his apartment building, too tired to climb the stairs, but unable to sleep. Tomorrow would determine everything. His mother's treatment, his future, his dreams of returning to the mathematical world he had been forced to abandon. He thought about Dr. Rodriguez, about the way she looked at him, sometimes with that strange expression that suggested half-remembered recognition. He wondered if she had figured it out yet, if she had connected the maintenance worker to the doctoral student who had left MIT 7 years ago, with promises to return that he had never kept. Part of him wanted to tell her, wanted to explain what had happened and why. But another part feared that revealing his past would somehow invalidate his present, would make his achievement seem less impressive if people knew he had formal training. Better to let them believe he was entirely self-taught, better to maintain the narrative that served the larger point about overlooked talent. Tomorrow would bring the ultimate test. Could he solve Sterling's deliberately impossible problem? Could natural talent combined with years of solitary study overcome institutional knowledge weaponized against him? Could one person's brilliance triumph over a system designed to exclude him? He didn't know, but he knew he had to try. For his mother, for himself, for everyone watching who had been told they weren't good enough, smart enough, credentialed enough to matter. The championship round awaited, and with it, the moment when everything would either validate or destroy the possibility that genius could emerge from anywhere if given the chance to shine. The championship morning arrived wrapped in the kind of October cold that bit through clothing and settled into bones. Outside Whitmore's main auditorium, a line had formed before dawn, people clutching coffee cups and phone chargers determined to witness history. By 8 o'clock, every seat was filled. Standing room disappeared by 8:15. Security eventually closed the doors, leaving hundreds outside, watching through live stream feeds on devices held in cold, numbed hands. Inside, the air thrummed with anticipation that felt almost physical. Camera crews positioned equipment along the walls, their lenses trained on 3 contestants who represented different visions of mathematical excellence. Sarah Mitchell Sterling's protege sat reviewing notes with the focused intensity of someone carrying her mentor's expectations. Derek Carter, Harvard's representative, projected the easy confidence of someone who had never seriously doubted his own brilliance. And Jamal Washington, still wearing maintenance coveralls beneath a borrowed jacket, sat motionless with his eyes closed. Catherine Sterling took the stage at precisely 9 o'clock. Her suit was immaculate, her makeup flawless, her expression radiating the kind of control that came from carefully constructed certainty. But anyone watching closely might have noticed a slight tremor in her hands as she gripped the podium, might have seen the muscles working in her jaw. Welcome to the championship round of the Yoler's Challenge. Her voice carried across the packed auditorium, amplified by microphones that broadcast her words to over 100,000 viewers worldwide. The competition had exploded beyond anything Whitmore had anticipated, had become a cultural flashpoint about merit and access, about who deserved recognition and how society determined worth. Today's challenge represents the highest standards of mathematical achievement. Given the unprecedented attention this competition has received, I'm implementing what I call the Sterling Standard. She paused, letting the phrase settle. Elena Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in her judge's seat, her instincts warning her that something was wrong with this framing. Instead of a single problem, contestants will face three tasks. First, solve a research-level problem in 90 minutes. Second, present your solution to a panel of expert mathematicians. Third, defend your approach against rigorous questioning from specialists. The format was brutal, designed to expose any gap between lucky insight and authentic expertise. And the problem itself, when it appeared on the screen behind her, made several mathematicians in the audience inhale sharply. Sterling had reached deep into her doctoral research, had pulled out a challenge that had consumed 3 years of her life with unlimited university resources and constant advisor support. The equations filled the screen with intimidating complexity, technical language that suggested depths of specialized knowledge most people would never acquire. Sarah Mitchell's eyes lit with recognition. She had studied Sterling's published papers, had access to the methodology, had spent years in seminars where this exact type of problem was dissected and analyzed. Derek Carter nodded slowly, his Harvard education providing familiar frameworks for approaching the challenge. But Jamal stared at the problem like someone reading a death sentence in a foreign language. You have 90 minutes. Begin. The timer started its merciless countdown. Sarah and Derek immediately began writing their pens, moving with the confidence of people working through territory they recognized. Their whiteboards filled with sophisticated equations building upon foundations laid in countless graduate seminars. Jamal's board remained empty. 10 minutes passed, then 20. His hand held chalk but made no marks. His eyes scanned the problem repeatedly, searching for any entry point into mathematics that required knowledge he simply didn't possess. The specialized techniques Sterling had embedded in the problem demanded years of focused study in areas his self-education hadn't reached. Sterling provided commentary for the live stream, her voice smooth with vindication. Advanced mathematics requires systematic knowledge built over years of rigorous training. We're witnessing the fundamental difference between authentic education and amateur enthusiasm. By minute 30, sweat had begun forming on Jamal's forehead, despite the auditorium's aggressive air conditioning. He had attempted 4 different approaches, each one collapsing under the weight of gaps in his knowledge. The specialized mathematical physics Sterling had chosen required familiarity with frameworks he had only encountered in passing theories he understood conceptually, but couldn't manipulate with the fluency real expertise demanded. The live stream chat filled with comments that ranged from sympathetic to cruel. This is painful to watch. He's completely lost. Sterling was right about needing proper credentials. The janitor narrative is over. At minute 45, Jamal made a critical error. Attempting to apply a theorem he had read about but never fully mastered, he introduced a logical gap that invalidated everything he had painstakingly constructed. He stood motionless, staring at the equations that mocked his inadequacy with their false promise. Sterling's voice cut through his despair like a scalpel designed for maximum damage. Perhaps we should allow struggling participants to withdraw with dignity rather than continue this painful display. The suggestion landed with devastating precision. News cameras zoomed closer, capturing the exact moment when unshakable confidence shattered into visible defeat. This image would be replayed millions of times, the moment a genius met reality, the moment natural talent encountered institutional knowledge. At minute 60, with 30 minutes remaining, Jamal set his chalk down. His shoulders sagged, his eyes closed. Every person watching understood they were witnessing surrender, the acknowledgement that some barriers couldn't be overcome through determination alone. Sterling smiled. Not broadly, not obviously, but enough that careful observers could see the satisfaction spreading across her features. The natural order was being restored before a global audience, proof that her assumptions about intelligence and education had been correct all along. But Dr. Rodriguez couldn't remain silent. She rose from her judge's position, her voice carrying unexpected authority. Before we continue, I want to remind everyone that mathematical history is filled with breakthrough discoveries made by individuals who ignored conventional wisdom and found new paths to truth. She wasn't helping Jamal directly, couldn't ethically do so as a judge, but her words carried meaning that resonated beyond their surface. The most profound insights often come from minds unbound by traditional approaches. Sometimes the greatest mathematical truths are found by those brave enough to see problems through completely fresh eyes. Something shifted in Jamal's posture. His eyes opened. A memory surfaced from years buried beneath the weight of survival and sacrifice. Something from his time at MIT, when mathematics had been his whole world rather than his secret refuge. Not identical to Sterling's challenge, but related through underlying principles that transcended specialized approaches. 15 minutes remained when he picked up his chalk again. What happened next would be analyzed for years. Jamal began writing not with the specialized techniques Sterling expected, not with the cutting-edge machinery that represented mathematical fashion, but with classical methods that had existed for over a century. Where Sarah and Derek built elaborate modern solutions using tools that required graduate-level training, Jamal constructed his approach using techniques so fundamental they appeared in undergraduate textbooks. He was treating Sterling's complex boundary value problem as a minimization challenge, finding the mathematical configuration that required the least energy. Like water flowing downhill to find the lowest point, like nature always choosing the path of least resistance, the mathematics revealed its structure when approached from this classical perspective. His chalk moved faster now, driven by the momentum of recognition. Where Sterling had used advanced functional analysis, he employed direct variational techniques. Where she had relied on sophisticated operator theory, he used energy estimates that any graduate student could follow. The mathematical community in the audience began stirring with recognition. This wasn't failure. This was something else entirely. Time expired at precisely 10:30. Jamal stepped back from his whiteboard, which displayed a complete solution using methods that hadn't been fashionable since his grandmother's generation, but remained mathematically bulletproof. Sterling stared at his work in shocked silence, her 3-year struggle with advanced techniques bypassed by approaches she had dismissed as outdated. The presentation phase began with mechanical formality. Sarah delivered competent explanation of Sterling's published methodology. Derek followed with similar results, solid but unremarkable. Then Jamal approached the microphone. I solved this problem using classical variational methods. His voice was steady despite the exhaustion radiating from every line of his body. The audience leaned forward, smartphones recording every word. While examining the challenge, I realized it could be understood as asking a fundamental question. What mathematical shape minimizes energy while satisfying the given constraints? Sterling interrupted with barely controlled fury. Mr. Washington, this problem requires advanced functional analysis and operator theory. Classical methods are insufficient for nonlinear boundary value problems of this sophistication. Jamal turned to face her directly, and something in his expressions suggested he had been waiting for exactly this objection. Professor Sterling, with respect, I believe your assumption about required methods may be unnecessarily limiting. Sometimes the most sophisticated tools aren't necessary if you choose the right approach. Mathematics doesn't care about fashion, it only cares about truth. The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything she had built her career defending. Several audience members who understood the deeper implications began to smile. This is undergraduate-level hand-waving. Sterling's composure was fracturing in real time. Where's the rigor? Where's the advanced analysis that separates real mathematicians from enthusiasts? Dr. Rodriguez stood abruptly, her movements silencing the rising murmurs. Actually, Catherine, I'd like to verify Mr. Washington's approach myself. The next 15 minutes felt suspended in amber. Rodriguez and 2 other expert judges examined Jamal's proof with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for major theorem announcements. They traced through each step, verified every logical connection, tested the boundaries of his approach. The auditorium held its collective breath while 100,000 viewers worldwide watched mathematical verification unfold in real time. Finally, Rodriguez returned to her microphone. Her expression carried the weight of someone about to change the course of multiple lives. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to announce that Mr. Washington's solution is mathematically rigorous, complete, and brilliant. He has solved a research-level problem using classical techniques in a way that illuminates the underlying structure that makes this challenge difficult. The auditorium erupted in thunderous applause. Live stream viewers exploded with celebration. Academic communities worldwide recognized they had witnessed something extraordinary, a moment when received wisdom about education and talent collided with evidence that demanded reconsideration. But Rodriguez wasn't finished. Her next words would detonate like a bomb beneath Sterling's carefully constructed reality. Throughout this competition, I've been troubled by familiar feelings about Mr. Washington's mathematical style. His approach, his insights, his elegant solutions reminded me of someone exceptional I once knew. She paused, her eyes finding Jamal among the contestants. The room fell silent again, sensing revelation approaching. I finally remembered. Jamal Washington was one of my most brilliant doctoral students at MIT 7 years ago. The shockwave rippled outward in concentric circles. Sterling's face went completely pale. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The implications crashed over her like cold water drowning the assumptions she had built her identity around. Rodriguez produced official documentation that she had requested from MIT the previous evening, her suspicions finally confirmed. Mr. Washington completed all PhD coursework with highest distinction. He finished qualifying exams, passed comprehensive reviews, and was deep into dissertation research under my supervision. His record includes a 3.94 GPA in graduate coursework, 2 published papers in leading journals, an outstanding teaching assistant award, and the prestigious Sloan Research Fellowship. Each fact landed like a physical blow. Sterling had spent weeks systematically humiliating someone whose academic credentials exceeded her own, had designed problems specifically to defeat someone who had been pursuing doctoral research while she was still an undergraduate, had made a cruel marriage joke to someone more accomplished than most faculty members she respected. Mr. Washington withdrew voluntarily during his final year to care for his mother during cancer treatment. His departure was a tremendous loss to our community. The live stream exploded with shock and outrage. Viewers realized they had witnessed systematic prejudice exposing itself before the world had seen someone brilliant and accomplished dismissed based purely on appearance and employment. Universities began sending messages within minutes offering immediate readmission and full funding. But Sterling heard none of this. Her world had collapsed so completely that the noise around her became meaningless. She sat in her judge's chair staring at nothing while her carefully constructed understanding of merit and worth and intelligence disintegrated into rubble. The expert panel reached their unanimous decision with unprecedented speed. Rodriguez approached the main microphone, her voice carrying across celebration that was already building. Ladies and gentlemen, we have our winner, Jamal Washington. The standing ovation lasted 4 full minutes. Camera crews captured the moment when merit triumphed over prejudice, when someone written off as irrelevant proved undeniable. Social media platforms couldn't handle the volume of sharing the moment, spreading across digital networks faster than servers could process. Someone in the audience shouted over the celebration. "So when's the wedding, Professor Sterling?" Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd as everyone remembered her flippant marriage proposal, her cruel joke that had circled back to haunt her before cameras broadcasting to millions. But Jamal approached the microphone one final time, his exhaustion evident but his dignity intact. Mathematics brought us together today through this competition. I hope it continues to bring people together across all boundaries and assumptions about where intelligence can be found. His grace and victory made Sterling's earlier cruelty seem even more damning, not because he highlighted it, but because he chose not to. His refusal to humiliate her in return somehow made the contrast between them more stark than any accusation could have achieved. Hours later, the auditorium had emptied except for 2 people. Sterling sat alone in the front row staring at whiteboards where her worldview had been systematically dismantled. Jamal approached quietly, having showered and changed into clothes that looked new, likely purchased with advance money from the prize he had just won. Catherine. He used her first name, speaking it gently despite everything she had done. She looked up with tears tracking mascara down her cheeks. "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you recognition of who you really are, and acknowledgement of who I became in trying to destroy you." Her voice broke on the final word. The facade she had maintained for years, the armor of credentials and publications and prestige, had shattered completely. What remained was someone confronting the ugliness of her own assumptions. I let prejudice blind me to brilliance. Worse than that, I weaponized institutional power against someone I should have recognized as a colleague. I'm ashamed of every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, every moment I treated you as less than human. Jamal sat beside her on the auditorium steps, his presence gentle, despite the justified anger he could have expressed. You're not the first person to judge by appearances, but you might be the first to truly understand what you were wrong about. That matters. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to voice, about my ridiculous marriage proposal. Sterling's cheeks burned despite the tears. Are you withdrawing the offer? Jamal smiled for the first time since the competition ended, genuine warmth replacing the careful neutrality he had maintained. Actually, if you're willing to get to know the real me, not the prejudiced professor, but the woman who just learned something profound about herself, I'd like to take you to dinner. As equals. I'd like that. I think we both have a lot to learn from each other. 6 months transformed them both in ways neither could have predicted. Jamal returned to MIT to complete his dissertation, his work even more sophisticated for the years spent outside formal academia. The perspective he had gained from cleaning floors where mathematics was taught gave him insights into making complex ideas accessible that his classmates who had never left the ivory tower couldn't match. Sterling established a scholarship program identifying overlooked talent among all university staff. She began teaching community college courses in the evenings, working with students who had been written off by systems that measured worth through narrow metrics. The humility this required, the acknowledgement of her own past blindness, made her a better educator than her earlier arrogance ever could have. Their relationship developed slowly, carefully built on mutual respect that grew into something deeper. They discovered that intellectual equals could challenge each other in ways that made both sharper, better, more complete. Their first real date involved arguing about topology over Ethiopian food for 3 hours. The conversation so animated that other diners watched with amusement. Marcus Webb had ended things within a week of the competition, unable to accept that Catherine had been wrong about something so fundamental. His loss, she decided, reflected his own limitations more than hers. Real growth required the courage to abandon positions that evidence had proven false. But their story sparked something larger than their individual transformation. Social media movements encourage people to look beyond uniforms and job titles, to recognize that brilliance existed in unexpected places. Universities nationwide reviewed hiring practices, discovered their own Jamal Washingtons working in cafeterias and maintenance departments and security offices. Countless stories emerged of brilliant minds trapped by circumstance rather than limited by ability. The lesson spread beyond academia. Businesses began looking differently at entry-level employees. Medical institutions reconsidered who they recruited. Even government agencies started programs identifying talent among populations they had previously overlooked. Because intelligence doesn't wear a uniform. Brilliance doesn't require a pedigree. Worth isn't determined by credentials or income or institutional affiliation. On a spring afternoon a year after the competition, Catherine Sterling and Jamal Washington walked across Whitmore's campus together. He wore the casual clothes of a returning PhD student. She had traded her designer suits for something more practical, more honest. They were discussing a collaborative paper, their different perspectives creating something neither could have achieved alone. Students noticed them whispered about the professor and the former janitor, about the competition that had gone viral, about the relationship that had emerged from confrontation. But they noticed them as equals now, as two mathematicians contributing to their field, as two people who had chosen each other despite every barrier society had placed between them. The most beautiful equations, it turned out, were sometimes found in the human heart. The most profound truths emerged when people had the courage to question their assumptions, to look beyond surfaces, to recognize that genius could emerge from anywhere if given the chance to flourish. How many extraordinary people are you overlooking today? How many assumptions are you making about the people serving your coffee, cleaning your offices, working jobs society deems ordinary? The next time you meet someone, look beyond the surface. Listen to their ideas. Respect their knowledge. You might discover that the person you least expect is exactly who you most need to know.